Okay, hi everybody. Welcome back to lesson 2 of Mission Citizen citizenship classes. So today we're going to be talking about American democracy and federalism. So we're just going to get right into it. Okay, so last lesson I told you all that the way we do lessons is that we start them with a quiz. Of course, last time we didn't have a quiz because that was our first lesson. So we're going to get started on our lesson quiz today, or our lesson 1 quiz today. So if you're just following along on your own, I would recommend that you go to our website at www.missioncitizen.org and you print out our quiz. And then just take a few minutes to try to fill that out. If you can do it without notes, great. But if you want to look at your notes from last time, that is fine too. And then just pause this video and come back once you have finished that quiz, and we'll go over the answers. Okay, so now assuming that you have done the quiz, have filled out all the questions that you can, we're just going to go ahead and go over the answers. So for question number 1, one reason the colonists came to America is freedom, political liberty, religious freedom, economic opportunity, to practice their religion, or to escape persecution. So any of those 6 answers would work. You only need one of them. Then for question number 2, 3 of the original 13 colonies were New Hampshire, Delaware, Connecticut, New Jersey, New York, North Carolina, South Carolina, Pennsylvania, Rhode Island, Massachusetts, Maryland, Virginia, or Georgia. So any of those 13, any 3 of those 13 is all you need to memorize. If you remember my tip from last week, I recommend doing the 3 news, New Hampshire, New Jersey, and New York, but you can choose any 3. For question number 3, Native Americans have lived in America since long before the Europeans arrived. And then number 4, African people or Africans were brought to America as slaves. Okay, moving on to number 5. One reason the colonists fought the British was high taxes or taxation without representation, because the British soldiers were forcibly staying in colonists' homes, also known as quartering or boarding, or you could say because they did not have self-government. For question number 6, Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. And the Declaration of Independence was adopted on July 4th, 1776. One thing the Declaration did was declare freedom from Great Britain. Okay, moving on to number 9. Rights in the Declaration of Independence include life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And remember, you only need to have 2 of those. At the Constitutional Convention, the Founding Fathers wrote the Constitution. And for 11, the Constitution was written in 1787. One author of the Federalist Papers was Publius, John Jay, Alexander Hamilton, or James Madison. Any of those would work, and if you only get the last name, that will be an acceptable answer as well. Okay, so I think we're getting to the end here of our quiz. For number 12, George Washington was the first president of the United States, and the father of our country was George Washington for number 13. And when you get to number 14, the answer will be Benjamin Franklin is famous for being a U.S. diplomat, being the oldest member of the Constitutional Convention, being the first Postmaster General, writing Poor Richard's Almanac, or starting the first free libraries. Any of those answers will work. Okay, so now that we've gone over the quiz, and feel free to just scroll back in the video if you need to spend a little bit more time on those answers, but we're going to get into learning the new information for this lesson. So we're going to start with founding principles. So the U.S. Constitution is the supreme law of the land, which means that no other law can contradict it. So the Constitution is supreme, meaning that the Constitution is the highest, most powerful law in this country. So if Congress or any other legislature were to pass a law that contradicts the Constitution or violates the Constitution, then the courts would what's called strike that law down, basically invalidate the law or void the law, and we would go with what the Constitution says because it is the supreme law of the land. So the Constitution's purpose is to define and establish government as well as to protect the basic rights of the people. So the Constitution is a big picture document. It doesn't contain like really detailed explanations about what to do about really specific issues. It's just kind of a general outline of what our government looks like, what the structure of this country is, and what the really fundamental rights we all have in this country that can't be violated are. And then the Constitution also establishes what's called rule of law, which means that nobody is above the law, even public officials. And the reason the Constitution includes this idea of rule of law is because the colonists had come from a long period of being ruled by Britain, and under the British government, the king was not subject to the law. So he could essentially act in whatever way he chose to act and was protected from any sort of legal action. And the colonists saw the abuses of power that this led to and decided that they believed that all people, regardless of their power, should not have the right to act exactly as they wish without any sort of punishment if they commit crimes. Okay, and just be remembering to take notes on your note sheet of what we have in bold. If you can't find the note sheet, it should be on our website, missioncitizen.org, or you should be able to find it in the description of this video as well. Okay, so now moving on to the rights of the people. So the U.S. Constitution begins with 3 words, we the people, and those 3 words establish the idea that is really the basis of the entire Constitution, and that is the idea of self-government, which essentially means that the government is run by the people for the people. So the Constitution starts with the words we the people to make it absolutely clear that it is the people who are have the power to form a government, and it is the people who will be running the government. So that's kind of the underlying foundation of our entire government, which is this idea that we should not be ruled by elites, we should be ruled by ourselves and people like us. Okay, so now that we've learned a little bit of information about the founding principles of America, we're just going to go ahead and do a quick quiz. If you'll remember from last time, normally in in-person classes, I just have people shout out the answer. So if you can just come up with the answer in your head or write it down, or feel free to shout it out if you would like to. And I would recommend trying this without your notes, but if you need to look at your notes, totally fine. So question number 1, what is the supreme law of the land? And then your answer is going to be the Constitution. My next question, what does the Constitution do? And your answer is going to be sets up the government, defines the government, or protects basic rights of Americans. Any of these 3 answers is fine. You don't need all 3. And if you want to say any of these answers in different words, that is also totally fine. So you could say establishes the government, or ensures that basic rights of Americans are not violated. Anything like that, as long as it has the same meaning, your answer will be considered correct. What is the rule of law? Rule of law is the idea that everyone must follow the law, leaders must obey the law, government must obey the law, or no one is above the law. Just 4 different ways of saying the same thing, and if you can find a different way of saying the same meaning, then that will work too. The idea of self-government is in the first 3 words of the Constitution. What are these 3 words? We the people. Okay. So now that we've done the quiz, we're just going to move on to America's economic and governmental structure. So to start, America has a capitalist or market economic system. You might also hear this called a free market economic system. So what this means is that American trade and industry is for the most part controlled by private institutions, not the government, which you might see in an economic system like communism, for example. So, branches of government. Our Constitution lays out 3 branches or parts of our federal government. These include the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch. And we're going to get into a little bit more about each of these branches in just a minute. So the legislative branch creates laws. And you have a national legislature, which is what's known as Congress, and then you also have state legislatures in each state. And Congress and most of these state legislatures consist of 2 chambers, the Senate and the House of Representatives. I believe there's one exception. I think Nebraska doesn't have 2 chambers, it has only 1. But other than that, most state legislatures just kind of mimic the structure of Congress, which is 2 chambers. Okay, so make sure you get down that the legislative branch creates laws. Okay, so now we're just going to go ahead and get into the executive branch. So the executive branch is responsible for executing and enforcing the laws that the legislature passes. So when the legislature passes a law, it's usually pretty broad and general, and the executive branch needs to make more specific, like little rules and guidelines underneath that broad law so that the government knows how to enforce the law and ensure that everybody who needs to be following the law is following the law, and there is accountability when people don't follow the law. So that's what the executive branch does, and the head of the federal executive branch is the President of the United States. And then the federal executive branch also includes the vice president and the president's cabinet, which is basically a group of advisors to the president. And then state governments also have executive branches that are structured a little differently from the federal one. So the head executive in states tends to be the governor, and then there are various other offices within the state executive branch that work along with the governor. Okay, and then the final branch is the judicial branch. So the judicial branch interprets the law and settles disputes regarding laws. So sometimes people don't necessarily agree on what the text of a law passed by a legislature truly means, and there are disputes about laws. And also sometimes laws are passed that contradict other laws, so you need kind of a third party to figure out what is the law that we are going to follow in this case. Yeah, okay, so the executive branch is made up of various courts, and it's a whole complicated system. It's a hierarchy that goes all the way down to courts that only serve districts, up to the most powerful court in the US, which is the Supreme Court. Okay, so I think we've covered the judicial branch, so now we're going to get into how does the Constitution prevent abuses of power in the government. So basically, the Constitution sets up a government with checks and balances and separation of powers. And those are two mechanisms that prevent any one branch from becoming extremely powerful and from dominating the other branches. So this ensures that the president, the Supreme Court, Congress, none of those branches of government or parts of our government can take control of the government and make decisions unilaterally without consulting with other branches of government. So it holds members of our government accountable to other members of our government to ensure that nobody is kind of going rogue and trying to become a dictator or a tyrant like the colonists experienced under the King of England. So I'm just going to get into each of these checks and balances and separation of powers a little bit more so you understand exactly what they mean. So with checks and balances, each branch of government has the ability to, quote, check or override the other branch's power. And each branch also has powers that balance out the other branch's powers. So these quote-unquote checks and balances allow each branch to limit the other's branches, and this prevents one branch from abusing its powers. So in this diagram on the right, you can see some examples of checks and balances. So the little hat is going to represent the executive branch, the building is the legislature, and the scale with the books and the gavel is the judiciary. So basically, if you look at some of these arrows, so you see that the executive branch has the power to veto legislation passed by the legislature, whereas the legislature has the power to check the president's power by impeaching that person. And so you see that the executive branch has the power to nominate judges, which kind of checks the power of the judiciary, and the judiciary has the power to declare presidential actions unconstitutional, which prevents the president from becoming too powerful. And then you also see that the legislature has the power to impeach judges. So if judges are abusing their power, the legislature can step in, and then the judicial branch has the power to declare laws unconstitutional. So the legislature can't just act in ways that disregard our Constitution. And you see how all of these different powers ensure that no one branch can gain power over all of the others and rule in a way that is unconstitutional or just abusing power. Okay, and then we're also going to talk about separation of powers. So separation of powers means that each branch has its own unique powers that other branches don't have. So you see in this diagram that the Constitution has distributed powers among each of the branches. So the legislature making the laws, the executive carrying out the laws, and the judicial branch interpreting the laws. And this ensures that, for example, the legislature isn't making the law and also determining what the law means. There's some level of kind of separation, and different parties have to agree in order to get something done in our government. And this, again, ensures that no one branch can act on its own. Okay, so now we're going to get into a quiz on the information we've learned so far. So again, just shout out the answer, or write it down, or just think about it in your head if you know it. So question number 1, what is the economic system in the United States? If you said the capitalist or market system or free market system, you are correct. Name one branch or part of the government. You could name Congress or the legislative branch, the president or the executive branch, or the courts or the judicial branch. Any one of those answers would be correct. Okay, what stops one branch of government from becoming too powerful? You can say checks and balances, or you can say separation of powers. Either one of those. Okay, so now that we've learned about kind of the different branches of government and the checks and balances and separation of powers that kind of keeps them all in check, we're now going to learn a little bit about federalism. So let's start by just defining what is federalism. So basically, the Constitution gives some powers to the national government and other powers to state governments. And this is what is called federalism. So, just like the national government, as I mentioned before, I believe, each state government has a legislature, an executive branch, and a judicial branch. So power is divided on the national level and the state level. And some powers are unique to the national government, such as the power to print money, declare war, create an army, or the power to make treaties with other countries. So make sure you get one of these powers written down on your note sheet. And then states are given other powers, such as the power to provide schooling and education, the power to provide protection in the form of police, power to provide safety in the form of fire departments, the power to give driver's licenses out, and the power to approve zoning and land use. So make sure you get one of these written down on your note sheet for state powers. And you'll notice that these state powers tend to be the things that impact your daily life more. So because state governments are more localized, they're probably what you're going to be interacting with on a more regular basis. So you might see police or fire departments in your community. You might go to the DMV to get a driver's license. You might send your kids to school or go to school yourself. And you might, zoning and land uses may be less obvious, but it does definitely play a big role in the way your city or town looks like. Okay. So now moving on to Oregon state government specifically. So the leader of the state executive branch, as I mentioned before, is called the governor. In Oregon, our governor is Kate Brown, so this woman to my right. And Oregon also has its own state legislature and judicial branch. You see on the bottom left, that's what our state legislature looks like in Salem. Then we also have the judicial department seal. So all state governments are going to have these three branches, and they will look different ways, but they are generally tend to be set up in a similar way to the federal government. Okay, so now for another quiz. Under our Constitution, some powers belong to the federal government. Can you give me one power that the federal government has? If you said print money, declare war, create an army, or make treaties, those would all be correct answers. Okay, under our Constitution, some powers belong to the states. What is one state power? Providing schooling and education, providing protection or police, providing safety or fire departments, giving driver's licenses, and approving zoning and land use. All of those are perfect answers for your naturalization interview. Okay, who is the governor of your state now? It is Kate Brown. And just a note on this question in particular, because governors change on a regular basis, you want to make sure that Kate Brown is still your governor when you take the test. If you take it in the near future, then she should still be the governor, but you just want to make sure because this answer changes, and if you say a previous governor, you will get the answer wrong on your naturalization interview. Also make sure that if you're going to take the test in like Vancouver for whatever reason, or somewhere in Washington or California or any other state, that you look up their state governor, because it will be specific to the state you do your interview in. Okay, so normally in an in-person class, we would talk about this discussion question: does your country of origin have a different system of government than the US? But because we are not all together for this lesson, I'm going to skip right past that and let you know that if you have any questions, you can feel free to email us at missioncitizen@gmail.com, and we will get back to you as soon as we can. Okay, well, thank you for listening to this lesson. I hope you got something out of it, and I will see you next time.